Okay, so the definition of full-time employee again becomes important. So all that stuff that we just talked about with your applicable large employer counting, whether you as the school are covered by Obamacare, forget that. So we talked about it, put a pin in it, set it to the side for now.
So you're just assuming you're an ALE now?
Yeah. So one of the things that you have to make sure of is to understand which of your employees on staff for reporting purposes were full-time employees. These we've talked about every year. In fact, we've used this slide every year, so I'm just going to put it all up here. The term full-time employee means any employee who is at least 30 hours of service per week or 130 hours of service in any calendar month. You'll remember, for reporting purposes, that teacher or that custodian that works in January 160 hours, but then quits in February, is still entitled to a report. Not because when you do the look back period where you measure what his weekly average is going to be over 30, but because he was full-time in at least one calendar month of the 2018 year. So these definitions we'll talk about more when we go through who you have to give this 1095 to, but keep in mind, for those of you that are measuring your paras across a calendar year, say from July 1 to June 30 of the next year, then excluding their break period, and then doing the average of their hours on top divided by the number of work weeks, those people might be full-time if they averaged over 30 hours, even if in some month they only had 115, like December or May or August, because there's actually two ways to be full-time. Confusing again, I know I see all these looks like, I swear I knew this at one point, but now I'm confused as hell. And I get that. I totally get that. Karen and I were having this conversation earlier.
Yeah.
So what you are doing right now to figure out who to offer insurance to is probably to some extent based on the new hire rules and all this. If you think they're going to be full-time, you're probably making the offer that the board has approved. Totally fine. But for those of you that are still diligently tracking the hours from year to year to figure out who's full-time and not, that's great. But for those of you who have said, the board doesn't really want to take the benefit away from somebody just because their average dips down to 29.9, so we're not going to worry about it. That's totally defensible as well. But you're going to have to know who is full-time for purposes of who gets this 1095 sheet. So you could be offering insurance to somebody and they don't get the 1095, right? That's the reason we're dredging all these bad memories back up.
If your board said anybody that wants can buy insurance, or we're going to offer a single to all paras get a single, you still have to figure out whether that para is a full-time employee in terms of filling out these reports. So some of you probably have not thought about this because you just decided we're going to offer everybody or nobody, but you still have to now separate the sheep from the goats in terms of figuring out who you're going to give the forms to.
We've got time for questions, so I promise if you have those, we'll get to those. But remember, if you're using that look back counting where you measure the person's, the preceding school year basically, figure out if they're full-time for the next year, that's an annualized calculation if you want it to be. Or if you're somebody who just knows that we didn't offer to this person who drives a regular route, but then picked up a bunch of activity routes and also sub for us, that person may have just happened to hit 137 hours in some month. They're still going to get the 1095C, not because you owe them insurance, not because they could subject you to penalty, but because in that 1 month they hit full-time status. So this was the downside of the government saying you can really hit full-time status in two ways, right? If your employer does the counting to average your weekly rate or your weekly hours or in any particular month. So if you're doing the, hey, we're averaging you para, you 9 or 10 month employees, we're averaging you over the course of a year. Remember, for figuring out their full-time status, you still have to exclude those periods of 4 weeks or more when they don't work. So if you're
the summer.
Yeah, so if your hours go in the numerator, your number of weeks in the denominator drops for any time they have a 4-week break or more that they don't work. So if there are 12 weeks in the summer that para doesn't work 1 hour of service, or let's call it 10 is probably more likely, then that means your denominator number when you put all their hours for the preceding period is actually down from 52 weeks to 42, right? You get to count the Christmas or the holiday break because that was only a 2-week break. But for any period of 4 weeks or more where they have a break, that comes out of the denominator. So that's, again, just part of the weird way that they set up how to count 3 different ways, basically. But if you've got a para who's getting insurance because your board said, we don't want to mess with it, this is an employee benefit, so we don't have to compete with the nursing home in town for good workers, that's fine. But it is actually going to confuse that person's accountant if they told them, I only work 27 hours a week and you give them a 1095. So even if you've ignored all of this because your board said, hey, we're going to offer insurance, you may still have to do some of this math
To figure out
who gets the form.